Welcome to the program. I'm Millicent Walker in Lagos. We begin with 2 people who have died and 3 injured in the aftermath of a Russian missile strike in the southeastern Ukrainian city of Dnipro yesterday. According to local authorities, a gas station was destroyed, cars were burned out, and a lorry was damaged on a street nearby. A representative of the state's emergency services, Ole Kushnaruk, said in front of a destroyed gas station that a pregnant woman died on the passenger seat of a car after refueling just before the explosion. Since Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered the invasion of Ukraine February 24, thousands of civilians have been killed and swaths of buildings have been destroyed. And Russian allegations that Ukraine is preparing to use a dirty bomb are transparently false. That's according to NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. The head of the military alliance made the comment on a trip to a U.S. aircraft carrier stationed in the Adriatic Sea and before the UN Security Council meeting at which Russia raised the issue. The allegations follow hints from Moscow that it might be forced to use a tactical nuclear weapon against Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said the dirty bomb allegation showed Russia was planning such an attack and seeking to blame Kyiv. Mr. Stoltenberg echoed comments from the United States warning Russia of severe consequences for any use of nuclear weapons. And U.S. President Joe Biden has said that Russia would be making an incredibly serious mistake if it used a tactical nuclear weapon against Ukraine. Now, Russia on Tuesday took its case to the UN Security Council that Ukraine is preparing to use the dirty bomb, that allegation. Well, this allegation follows hints from Moscow that it might be forced to use it. The Western and Ukrainian officials, they're saying it's misinformation, a pretext rather for escalating the war. Moscow sent a letter detailing the allegations to the United Nations, and Russia raised the issue also at the closed meeting. They follow hints from Moscow that, it might be forced to use the tactical nuclear weapon against Ukraine, whose President Volodymyr Zelensky said that the allegations showed Moscow was planning such an attack and indeed was to blame Kyiv. Well, today, the Kremlin responded to all of the allegations, counter-allegations, saying that it would vigorously continue to make the case to the international community that it believed Ukraine intended to detonate a dirty bomb with radioactive contaminant. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov told reporters Moscow wanted to prompt an active response from the international community. Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu on Tuesday made calls to his Indian and Chinese counterparts to convey Moscow's warning following on from a series of calls with NATO defense ministers. Of course, Ukraine and its Western allies have rejected Russia's allegation, voicing concern about a further escalation. Well, let's talk some more about all that is happening, Russia's war in Ukraine and indeed its implication for the rest of Africa. Joining me now, Mr. Kosiso Udodi is a policy analyst. He joins me right now. Thank you for joining me on the program.
Thank you. Hi, Melissa. Thank you for having me.
Hi, good to see you. First, what's your take? I mean, since the invasion, February 24, what do you make of it? And of course, you know that Russia calls it a special military operation.
Okay. So when this happened, the first time I saw on February the 24th, as I followed it, it took me back to the fall of the Soviet Union and how after Yeltsin left, Putin came in, and Putin made it the core of his foreign policy to bring back the glory of the Soviet Union. So all of this that is happening right now is just Putin throwing a tantrum due to NATO's growing influence in Europe and the fact that European countries who used to be in the Soviet Union are migrating or are looking towards NATO and the EU for economic development and sustenance. And I remember when before the negotiations before the war began, And in those negotiations, Putin requested that NATO scale itself back and then drop any country that had joined before 1997. And that would have reduced the ranks of NATO. But that was Putin basically saying, look, I'm trying to revive the glory of the Soviet Union. I'm trying to get us back to what we used to be. And if you look at the way politics is played in Russia, it's usually politics in Russia is brutal, is a show of power. So not also is this a test of Russia's ability to exert influence in Europe, but it is also a test of Putin's ability to exert power over his domain. And the problem now is Putin cannot afford to lose. Putin cannot afford to lose face. And that makes the situation more dire because he would go to any point, he would go to literally any point to make sure that he does not lose face in Europe or in the face of his followers in Russia, the Kremlin.
Should President Biden... I was going to say that should President Biden directly negotiate with Russia to end the war? We understand that Congress withdrew a letter that they wanted that initially, because on the other hand, from the larger international community and the agencies, the UN, countries like Turkey and other countries, what's your take on their efforts and, you know, negotiation being a central element to ending this?
Personally, I think that it is not in anyone's place to go to the table on behalf of Ukraine. I think that whatever terms or whatever agreements are reached in this crisis is the sole decision of the people of Ukraine. And I think that President Biden understands this, and that is why he has had the US play a more supportive role in this crisis, because you have to understand that Putin seeks to drag NATO into this war. Putin seeks to drag the US into this war. And so it would be wise for the US to play a more supporting role. It would be wise for the US to sit back and let the Ukrainians make the decisions. And I think this also applies to members of the international community, because you know, Putin seeks to expand this war. He seeks to create an excuse for escalation. So far, that's the behavior that he has exhibited from the beginning. He has sought to escalate the war. He has sought to bring more people in, make it messier, you know, and that would happen if people begin to go to the table on behalf of the Ukrainian people. No one else deserves to make decisions on behalf of the Ukrainian people, but the Ukrainian people. So I think, and the thing is, at this point, windows for negotiations are closing, because this morning Russia started nuclear exercises. They say it's a routine thing, but you know the world is very doubtful of Russian foreign policy anymore. So they say, oh, we're doing it is routine, it's a routine exercise, but no one believes that, and the situation seems to be escalating. And as Russia escalates, the place of negotiations, the window for negotiations, close. And I don't think that's a very great thing in any crisis, for window for negotiations to close. It's always that's the calm before the storm.
Well, when we're looking at this, seeing as, you know, how the war has, you know, persisted up till now, what role would you say African leaders have played so far in the conflict?
I think Africa has, to a great extent, underperformed in this entire crisis, because so far African foreign policy in Africa is very underdeveloped, and that does not put us in a place to sway the outcome of things. Our foreign policy, our trade is still dependent. So many things in Africa are still dependent on importation. Our foreign policy stance is weak. It's mostly about our foreign policy stance is never about geopolitics. It's mostly about trade and selling oil, you know, and receiving foreign aid. And that does not put us in a place to, it does not help us, it does not put us in a place where we can sway the outcome of events. we cannot issue sanctions, we cannot sway the outcome of events because we are dependent. And so African leaders have for the only time I saw African leaders participate in activities in the crisis was when they voted against the annexation of parts of Ukraine a few days ago at the UN. And I was very impressed with African countries because, if I recall correctly, almost all African countries voted for Putin to leave Ukraine. And so far, that has been the most that African countries have done, and it is quite disappointing, really, Millicent. It is because if you look at Africa's capacity for energy, you would think that as at the time when the sanctions on Russia were kicking in, as at the times when the oil sale bans were kicking in, that was the point, that was the moment that Africa was supposed to seize. Africa was supposed to seize that moment and get into the market. That was the time for Africa to cement its place in the energy market, and Africa fell short. So I think this is a sign for us that we need to improve our foreign policy. We need to take advantage of situations better. We need to be better prepared. We need to work on we need to generally work on our sectors and our industry and put ourselves in positions where we can fill gaps, and we can serve the international community.
And you mentioned the number of African countries that voted against the annexation of Ukraine regions by Russia. It appears 26 out of 54 African countries voted against that, which was vetoed, a similar text in the Security Council last month. But largely 143 of members, moved that motion that it shouldn't happen. Some of the countries, African countries now that abstained, include Mali, the Central African Republic, Ethiopia, the Republic of Congo, South Africa, Sudan, Uganda, Zimbabwe, to mention a few. But let's talk about, the challenges that you think have impacted Africa, and this is since the war began.
Okay, so for challenges, Africa has generally been dependent, in terms of consumer goods, in terms of technology and transportation infrastructure. We've largely been dependent on importation. And so anytime that crisis happens, it always affects us. Because Africa has seen, a lot of African countries have seen the value of their currencies eroded due to the energy crisis. And it kind of piggybacks, because when you look at how the energy crisis is getting worse in Europe, you take a look at that and you see that factories in Europe are closing down. And we are dependent on factories in Europe for consumer goods, things as little as chocolate, things as little as things as little as technology, like very small, like little technologies like pens. We are heavily dependent on factories in Europe for these things. And so as the cost of energy increases in Europe, that is going to reflect on the general cost of items in Africa. And that is affecting our economy heavily, because people are no longer able to afford the things that they were able to afford as at January. The prices of things are almost doubling, and it's only going to get worse. Hopefully, we are hoping that the energy crisis in Europe can get better, and if that does not happen, it doesn't spell well for Africa, because as long as we remain dependent on importation of consumer goods, as long as we remain dependent on importation of technology, as long as we remain dependent on importation for transport technology, for even foreign aid. Because if you look at our health sector and programs in the health sector, there are a lot of programs that are dependent very heavily on foreign aid. And as the energy crisis bites harder, a lot of countries are going to have to make tough decisions. They have to make tough calls. They have to cut budgets. They have to cut the amount of money they send out for foreign aid. And that does not leave us in a great place. So that means that a lot of our health programs are going to be affected because of the absence of funding. And this does not only happen, if you look at the current situation, for example, during the COVID-19 crisis, we imported a lot of nose masks from China. And seeing as Xi quite recently solidified his place in power.
Another term.
Yes, another term. And with what he's done now, with the way he structured things now, he can possibly remain president for life. And he's saying things like annexing Taiwan. He's saying things like going trade wars with the US, economic wars with the US. And as these things pop up, Africa needs to ask itself, where do we stand? How are we going to be able to survive if we depend heavily on importation of technology, on importation of machinery, on importation of food, consumer goods? How do we survive these periods?
So when I'm thinking of surviving the crisis, I'm thinking perhaps the AFCFTA, African Free Trade Agreement, playing a role, or maybe it's not a question of if, but when, because seeing as the character of nations could start changing to first look out for themselves before others, kind of like what we saw with the COVID-19 vaccines. But then what do you see the goals of growth, rapid development for the continent, Africa?
Yes, so I think that agreement is a very vital agreement because that agreement has the power to drive Africa's industry. I think that was a very good initiative by the African Union, and it needs to see more adaptation. That initiative needs to see more adaptation because so far there's been very poor adaptation by African countries. Not everybody has come to terms with accepting that policy and putting it into their national planning processes. And it is because that policy single-handedly can connect trade in Africa. We have the ability to decentralize manufacturing for things like consumer goods. I remember when I went to Accra, one of my favorite things in Accra was the chocolate. And it was manufactured right there in Accra. So the problems that the initiative has come to solve are the problems that have been hampering Africa's industrialization for decades. And that initiative has the ability to take us to our next level of industrialization. But the question remains, are African governments willing to adopt that initiative? Are they willing to consider that in their policy-making processes? So that's the question.
Indeed. I think we'll leave it on that note. We'll talk some more. I mean, the war still continues, even though a lot of people hope that, it comes to an end. And then, countries, especially Africa, should also be looking at ways to fortify its growth and development as well. We want to appreciate you. Thank you so much. Kosiso Udodi is a policy analyst. Thank you for joining us on the program.
Thank you very much. You're welcome. You're welcome.
Well, for a bit more with what's going on in Ukraine, refugees who fled the wake of Russia's invasion should stay abroad this winter due to blackouts created by Moscow's bombardments of critical energy infrastructure. The Ukrainian minister, in an interview broadcast on Ukrainian national television yesterday, Deputy Prime Minister Irina Vereshchuk told Ukrainians currently sheltering abroad that they should wait until spring before returning to Ukraine.
I'd like to take this opportunity to ask them not to return. We need to survive the winter. Unfortunately, the network won't survive it. You can see what Russia is doing. Everyone sees everything. To return now is to risk yourself and your children, your vulnerable relatives who may be ill, bedridden, or elderly. So please do not do it. If you have the possibility, stay abroad. Spend spent the winter abroad. Obviously, in the spring, when I very much hope we will have our Kharkiv region and our Kherson region rebuilt, as well as the rest of Ukraine, we want you back in Ukraine. We want our children to live here, to go to school here. But for now, let's hold off, because we believe that the situation will only get worse, and we have to survive this winter. Let's survive this winter. Let's get through it, and then we will think what to do next.
Welcome back. We continue with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Ukraine's external financing needs will be around $3 billion a month through 2023 in a best-case scenario, but could rise as high as $5 billion if Russian bombing doesn't end. This, according to IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva. The International Monetary Fund is working with Ukrainian authorities to help define and implement its macroeconomic policies. She said the IMF was working towards a full-fledged IMF lending program for Ukraine. On inflation, she said central banks should keep raising interest rates further to fight inflation until they hit a neutral level, though in most cases they have not reached this point.
The sense is that the faster this war ends, the faster reconstruction of Ukraine will take place. And again, I want to concentrate on what we at the IMF are primarily focused on, and it is the functioning of the country now and in 2023. And there we have run our analysis on the numbers together with Ukrainian authorities. Ukraine would need somewhere between best case scenario 3 billion, worst case scenario up to 5 billion a month over 2023. So my plea is, let's concentrate on the immediate needs of the country as we plan the reconstruction going forward. The outpour of support for Ukraine did bring countries like Indonesia providing relief. And to think of how we can help Ukraine, it is actually best if the whole world comes together. At this point, we look for getting to a neutral mode, and in most places we are not quite yet there. And let me just be clear why this is necessary, because when inflation runs high, that undermines growth. It hits the poorest parts of the population the hardest. So it is truly a must for central banks to bring inflation down. The new Prime Minister comes with a platform that he has shaped during his days as a Chancellor, and it is one of being very prudent in bringing fiscal discipline in the UK. So I expect to see that he would be moving the UK on the path that he shaped as a Chancellor towards medium-term fiscal sustainability. I listened carefully to him talking to the British people, and this is a message that should resonate across the world. These are tough times, and tough times require tough decisions. Thank you.
That's the IMF Managing Director speaking in Berlin a day before the European Central Bank is widely expected to raise rates by 75 basis points. Well, let's take you to the jailed U.S. basketball star, Brittney Griner. White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre has said that the United States will engage with Russia to bring her home after a Russian court upheld her 9-year drug sentence. Griner, a two-time Olympic gold medalist, was arrested February 17 at a Moscow airport a week before Russia sent troops into Ukraine. The soaring of ties between Russia and the West has further complicated the talks between Washington and Moscow to secure her release.
Everybody, our hearts are with Brittney Griner, her wife and her family, friends and teammates in light of the appalling news out of Russia today. This news only increases the urgency of our efforts to bring Brittney home. The Biden administration remains in regular touch with representatives from Brittney's family. And as National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said this morning, the administration has continued to engage Russia through multiple channels in recent weeks to urge them to respond to our efforts to negotiate a resolution to this. As I've said many times before, this is a priority for us. It's going to continue to be a priority for us. And but what I also said at the end of the statement I made at the top is that we need Russia to negotiate in good faith. Look, it's fair to say that we have been in contact, right? And the lines of communication continue to be open. I'm certainly not going to negotiate from here, from this podium or in public, and so therefore we're not going to get into greater details. But again, we have been very clear that Brittney Griner and Paul Whelan need to be home. They should be home right away, and the president's going to do everything that he can to bring detained Americans back home.